Hello out there in Radio Land. On this week's episode of Kruegerecords, I'm joined by my old and dear friend Dr. Sean Michael Smith, Assistant Professor and Chair of Undergrad Studies for the Department of Philosophy at the University of Hawaii. Sean and I have been friends since university, where I was first made aware not only of his incredible intellectual aptitude, but of his remarkable musical acumen. He's quite simply the best progressive metal drummer I've ever seen, a veteran of bands like Epsilon and Omnivert, and today he's brought a record for us to listen to. Squeegee the hell out of your third eye, friends, because this is Kruegerecords. Welcome to Composer's Kruegerecords, an exclusive Patreon series where my musically inclined guests take me and you on a deep dive into their favorite albums, artists, and songs. I'm your host, but you already know that, so let's get to the important part. As you heard in the intro, my guest today is my dear friend, Dr. Sean Smith. We've been friends for a very long time, which is why I'm not going to call you doctor through this entire episode, and we've talked about music for years. So I'm delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
This is one of those episodes that I've been looking forward to. This is like on the main show, we're like, oh, we can't do, Vertigo or E.T. or something immediately because that's like best of the best. And I kind of felt the same way here. I was like, I know this is going to be a great episode and I know it's going to be a really cool record. But for those of you, for those of my listeners that don't know you, because you are living away from the continent at the moment, diligently working away in academia, I would love for you to give them a little bit of background about how you came to music, because I mentioned in the sting that you are a drummer and a fucking good one. So I would love to hear a little bit about your journey into music.
Into music. Wow. Yeah. So I honestly, when I was a kid, I want to say in roughly grade 5 or grade 6, so even a little bit younger than my kid is now, I was chosen by the music teacher at our school to be a percussionist in the junior band, which normally only had students from grade 7 and 8. And so there were 3 of us in my class that were, at that point, you would do vocal music up till the end of grade 6. And then in grade 7 and 8, you would learn actual instruments, but they were short on percussionists. So they were like, you 3 are sharp. So I want you to come in and learn to play percussion instruments. So I did that. And then in grade 7, I started playing the trumpet. But I had always been obsessed with the drums. I really always just wanted to play them. My dad raised me on 70s prog rock, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who. He was less a fan of the Beatles, but since I was very, very small, my father really kind of impressed upon me the power of that era of music. And then in the early mid 90s, when everything in Seattle blew up, he was super drunk on grunge rock. And so, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, he was like, this is the good shit. Like, he was really into it. And we would always drive these long 2.5-hour trips from my mom's house down to my dad's house when we would go to visit him. And so we were just always listening to music. And that is really where I learned to love music. And then once I got obsessed with drums, it took a number of years, actually. I begged my parents for drums since I was in early middle grade school, but I didn't get my first drum set until my 16th birthday. Or no, that's a lie. It was the Christmas of my 16th year. Mm-hmm. My stepmother worked overtime for a few months and bought me a fairly low level intro drum kit. The cymbals were so flimsy that I had bent them into trash can shapes within a month. But it was all over after that. I never stopped playing the drums after that. We're coming up on the 20-year mark of the release of my first band's full-length record, and I I haven't played in bands in the last couple of years because of the pandemic and my location, but I've just always played the drums since then, and it's been a core feature of my personal identity since I was, you know, very small, and that's powerfully informed my listening habits and vice versa. And I've continued to be something of an audiophile and rather obsessive about certain bands and albums and songs, which is, you know, why I chose this particular record that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, this is something, a bit of a peek behind the curtain for our listeners, because like I said, I've known you for a very long time, and you've turned me on to some truly exceptional music, some of which has been I feel like you and I fall on slightly different sides of the spectrum, insofar as a musician, I've been a songwriter. And you are a drummer, and not just a drummer, but you know, you have been in the prog world, and this is a very, very technical and sophisticated kind of music that does not rely as heavily on lyrics as perhaps other genres do. So you've turned me on to some great shit. I remember listening to Hospital Music with you, the Mac Good record, which was very lyrically heavy. This is not, and this genre seems to be very much personal for you, and very much a place of safety and health for you. And I'm curious whether you can give me a little bit of background on what that genre, whether it's prog metal. I don't know. I'm aware that peripherally that there are a lot of subgenres and a lot of things going on inside of the metal universe, and it is not my wheelhouse generally. So I'd love if you could break down a little bit about your musical taste as it refers to that genre, since that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. So it's actually quite a complicated question, so I'll try to be concise about it. I would consider this band to be one of the pioneers of what's sometimes called post-metal or progressive metal. I think this is a subgenre of metal that owes its entire existence probably to Tool, who are sort of the forerunners of this kind of music, in the sense that they were really kind of experimenting with pace and power, and coming out of a lot of different influences. But I think how I understand this particular genre is that it's a version of heavy music that takes a lot of influence from post-rock bands, especially bands like Mogwai, Sigur Rós, Explosions in the Sky, bands that really kind of championed instrumental music. Not all instrumental, but mostly instrumental music. I mean, Sigur Rós obviously has lots of vocals, but even there, the vocals tend to be just another instrument.
Instrumental, really. Yeah.
And you know, metal, when it really came up and became important through the Big Four, in particular Metallica, when it hit the mainstream, metal is an aggressive form of music. And one of the things I've really liked about this band, ISIS, and the whole post-metal or progressive metal subgenre, of which I sort of deeply identify, is that it has a kind of weight to it. It demands your patience. It's more experimental with melodies, and they're not afraid to riff on a single idea for like half a song before they even make a transition or a dynamic shift. And for me, that kind of long form compositional dynamic really sort of reaches back to my early childhood influences of listening to Pink Floyd. And the recognition that, like, no, we can write a 12-minute song and it will be amazing. And these guys are, I think, really trying to do that in a way that, for me, constituted a kind of transition, a real transition in my aesthetic sensibilities for listening to more heavy music. You know, I was really into bands like the Dillinger Escape Plan and other kind of post-hardcore technical music that was very intense and vocal centered and just a bit manic. And I never really liked doom and sludge. It was too slow for me. It didn't communicate with me on an emotional level in the way that I wanted. But as I transitioned out of my teenage years and into my 20s and then into my parenthood, I found that sort of the frequency that I was enjoying music on was becoming lower. Like I wanted it, I don't need it to be fast and crazy as much as I need it to be heavy and meaningful. And this album for me was just devastating to listen to. It's just like, it's such a heavy record, but it's slow and patient, and it makes you wait. And then when it delivers, you've earned it. And that really kind of changed my understanding of songwriting, and changed my listening habits, and really kind of, I'd much rather listen to a 9-minute song that is really thoughtful and takes me on a journey than a 3-minute song that's super catchy. And I love pop music, and I love the ability to craft a 3-minute song that's perfect from beginning, middle, and end. But I think it's just a matter of, as a player, the music I've always wanted to play is the longer form, complex, dynamic storytelling kind of sounds. And so my listening habits are quite diverse, but my playing habits are a bit more monolithic within this subgenre. And that sort of reflects my emphasis on this kind of music as a listener.
And that's kind of why I wanted to sidebar very quickly, because I think there is a, what's the word I'm looking for? I think that there is sort of an overriding sense about music like this that is hand in glove with being kind of gatekeepy. The people that I've met historically in my travels as a musician who are into this kind of stuff are the same sorts of people who are into experimental jazz. And they're very, very hipstery about it. And they tend to be, well, you know, you wouldn't really understand. You should go listen to this. And the reason that I bring this up is because you are also a fan of like Taylor Swift.
Sure.
And I believe Carly Rae Jepsen was on your list for a while too.
Is a Canadian national treasure in my humble opinion.
Okay, so I wanted to bring that up because I wanted to differentiate you from that sort of Simpsons comic book guy-esque vibe that we get from this music sometimes. Because I tell you, Tool fans, man.
Yeah, we're the worst.
Oof, sometimes. But at the same time, it is of interest to me that you drew those comparisons, because when I listened to this, and this is, by the by, can you tell us the name of this record? This is ISIS.
Yes, this is an album called Panopticon by the band ISIS. It was released in 2004.
2004.
On, I believe Ipecac Records.
Okay, so this brought me right back to a friend of the show, Brent Chittenden, who's an old friend of mine, who sort of introduced me to the world of industrial music and post metal. And so like I listen to this and I hear Godspeed.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Yep. I hear 9 Inch Nails to a certain degree. There's definitely Trent Reznor has taken influence, or they've taken influence from him. There's definitely a through line there. And I can't speak to this genre very well, but I'm curious because a band like 9 Inch Nails became part of the public zeitgeist, the sort of central consciousness. Pop, you know, Closer was a pop song.
Yeah,
kind of. Why are these guys different, and why do you think that they aren't? Because I had never heard of ISIS before I talked to you. Why do you think they are not as well known as Tool or as Trent or as people that are sort of associated or peripheral to this kind of music?
Yeah, I mean, so the closest popular band that these guys resemble is Tool, and they're actually very close with Tool. So they're on this record, for example, Justin Chancellor, the bass player of Tool, like helped them. Like he was part of the process. And the album they released after this, which is called In the Absence of Truth, that album had a lot of influence and participation from Adam Jones, the guitar player of Tool. And the drummer of this band actually became Danny Carey's drum tech. So they're all very close. And when Tool toured the 10,000 Days record, ISIS was their opening band for like a number of legs of the tour. So they did kind of get to a certain stage, you know, say B tier stage, you know, mostly through the tutelage of a band like Tool. But they never really got to their own tier. They were well respected by the alt metal community, well respected. But even a band like Meshuggah, which toured with Tool in their early days, and I think kind of invented the djent sort of subgenre of metal and has become their own, you know, they are the top of the field when it comes to alternative heavy metal. I think the reason ISIS never really fully broke, and they eventually broke up, you know, just sort of faded out, is because their music is very interstitial. It meanders. It's not, it doesn't, it demands patience. And sometimes when music makes a demand on you, that can create an aversive reaction in the listener.
Yes.
A band like Tool, who's not afraid to write a 10-minute song, their music is very pleasing to listen to. It requires patience, but there's enough going on that you're also like, wow, this is wild. Whereas when you listen to ISIS, it's very good music, but it is not technically sophisticated.
Okay, I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah. And I think that because they're kind of in this weird in-between space between sounding like a fuzz-boxed Mogwai record with a lot more distortion.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like really kind of plugging into progressive metal elements that make bands like Tool very popular.
Yeah.
But they're not really fully in any one of those categories. And so when you listen to them, it's like, it's not always obvious what's going on. And in order to really get them on their own terms, you have to pay attention and you have to really be patient, because what they're doing is heavy in the sense that it's weight, like you'll feel it weighing on you. Mm-hmm. And you have to get through it in some way. Like some of the songs on this record, in particular, tracks 5 and 6, they're like pushing 10 minutes long each. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they meander a bit much. Like they're actually not, like some of this is, they're a bit uneven in some ways. So for me, ISIS is a band that they produce some songs that for me are like utterly transcendent. But then there are other things where I'm like, this shouldn't have been a 10-minute song. Like this is too much. This is too exploratory, too meandering, too self-indulgent. And so maybe the simplest way to answer your question is say they're a bit inconsistent.
One of the things I noticed about them when I was listening to the record today, because I went for a walk in the pouring ass rain, because I was just like, I'm going to go for a walk. And I listened to this record, and great walking music. There is a meditative quality to this record that I understand. It made immediately, like as I started listening to it, I was like, oh, I get why Sean likes this. But one of the things I wanted to bring up was the lack of sophistication, because when I was walking around today, the first thing that came to my mind, and stay with me on this one because it's going to sound a little weird, but it reminded me of Green Day. And because if you go back and you listen to Dookie and you strip out all the vocals, okay, you strip out Billy Joe's songwriting, you are left with a very generic 4-chord band with a drummer that is way the fuck better than they have any reason to be for that band. And I really, really felt the same way about this record, because there was a lot of the guitar work. There was very little vocal work at all.
Yeah.
And the vocal work that was there falls into a category that I struggle with, because he's screaming and I can't necessarily understand the lyrics. I had to go look them up. But there was very little in the way of vocals, and the guitar work, while it was sonically interesting from a production standpoint, if I was to play those songs, it's very rudimentary. It's very 3-chord wall of sound kind of, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I did find that the drummer was the most interesting part of what was happening. And I'm curious whether that had anything to do with your interest in this record.
No, actually. Okay. I don't actually like this drummer very much.
Really?
Yeah, he's good, but I don't like the way he plays. I find his playing to be too on the backbeat. He doesn't attack the songs in a way that I would like, even though they're slow. For me, the thing I love about this band is their conviction. The bass player is, for me, musically the most interesting part of this band. If you listen to the bass guitar, he is. I think he is the secret MVP of the band, for sure. Especially on songs like In Fiction, which is my favorite track on the record, and Grinning Mouths,
which is the last track, yeah.
the bass player is a genius, in my opinion. But the drumming is good from a technical point of view, but I find him to be a bit too blocky. Very like, and it's just kind of like very cubical in a way. And sometimes that actually creates a sense of rigidity when I feel like the music actually needs to flow a bit more. This drummer doesn't have a lot of funk sensibility. He doesn't have, his flow is very truncated. He's a technically quite a gifted drummer, but his particular style, his personality on the drums is too robotic for me. And I prefer my drummers to have a bit more slink in their flow rather than regimentation. So he actually gets in the way for me sometimes. But I think for me, the reason this is such a special record for me, and some of the songs on it are so special, is because it was the first time I saw, like, they have 3 guitarists, and one of the guitarists does keyboards as well. And their ability to layer and create tension and draw things out and then deliver and then like crush you with like a resolve, just like unified monolith of sound is like their dynamics, their understanding of dynamics, of push pull, of development of an idea is quite profound. And whenever I listen to their music, you know, key tracks of theirs, I am like reliably moved to tears. Like I am like very emotional. Like this is the first album band really where certain key tracks, I listen to them and I'm like, this sounds like how I feel at the core of me. And that makes me feel seen. And so when I listen to it, it's like emotional validation. It's just like, wow, you understand the weight of this, of all of this, of living a life, of dealing with reality. Their music, to me, communicates that kind of urgency and intensity, and it coaches patience. And I listen to it for those reasons. When I want to like reflect on the discipline of life and the patience required to achieve great things, I listen to their music because their music sounds like how I feel. And that's what I want when I listen to music.
This is exactly why I do this show, because those are the sentiments that I am going for. When was the first time you heard this? Did you hear it in 2004? I don't remember.
It was right when it came out because I saw them tour this record. So I was in university and I had, met this guy through my ex-wife, who was a, friend and like a super intense dude in the Toronto music scene. And when he found out I like Tool, like we could talk music, and he was like, you should listen to ISIS. And I started listening to their album before the one they released before this, which kind of made them huge. It was called Oceanic. And everyone was like, wow, this is special. And then, so Panopticon was the follow-up to Oceanic. And so I listened to it right when it came out. And then I went and saw them play at Lee's Palace on the tour for this record.
Here in Toronto.
Yeah. And it was a very special experience for me. I have been performing live in the Toronto music scene for a number of years. And my model of what a good live performance was in terms of like a heavy band was very much modeled on the kind of frantic, technically sophisticated kind of performance you would see from a band like Dillinger Escape Plan, which was kind of the paradigm of like musical genius for me as a late teenager and in my early 20s when I was still playing in my band. So these guys are kind of the opposite. They're slow and they're deliberate in a way that when I saw them play live, I'd never seen anybody so focused and intense on a stage in my life. Like I thought they were going to like saw their guitars in half. They were so intense and they weren't dancing around. They stood still and they just sat there fucking playing their instruments and sweating like they were. I was just like, I was in the front row, like right, just looking at them. And I was like, this is so fucking intense. I'm going to cry. And I loved it because there were no there was no song and dance, there was no antics, there was no stage banter, it was not, they just came out and played the songs like their lives depended on it, and they fucking left. And it just blew me away. Like, I was just like, this is so intense. And the record that I've been listening to, it translated live so well. And it's just like the feeling of just looking up at a wave and the awe of just seeing how powerful it is, and then just letting it fucking hit you. That's what their music is. And when I saw them do it live, I was just a convert at that point. I was like, this is so good.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because it brings to mind the first time I heard Henry Rollins talk about seeing the Ramones, where he was like, it was just unbelievable bursts of 3-minute intensity where they just came out and there was no, like you said, no banter, no fanfare. Hi, we're the Ramones. This is our song. 1, 2, 3, 4. And they just go into it. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for bands that have that dedication to their craft, where they're like, look, yes, we're here to entertain you, but we're not in the way that you want necessarily, not in the way that you were expecting, not in the way that you're going to go, hello, Seattle, and like, are you guys having a good time tonight? Like, that's not this band.
No.
This is not and I'm actually surprised. I would love to hear a little bit more about your experience with the live show, because this does not feel to me like a live band. This feels like you sit in your room and you put this on with your very expensive speakers, and you have an experience, you have an encounter with this music.
It's both, and the live experience for me was, I think what I took from this band watching them perform live, and I saw them open for Tool as well. I saw them, I think, live 3 times.
Because they're no longer a band, right? Like they
broke up. Yeah, they released 2 more records after this one and then broke up. And Buzz Osborne of the Melvins got mad because he was a huge fan of the band, and he was mad at them for breaking up, because he's just like, they finally found their sound and were really good, and then just broke up. Like, it was just like stupid. Like he just got really mad.
Buzz is also mad a lot.
Yeah,
he gets mad about a lot of stuff.
So yeah, I agree with you that an album like this and their other albums as well are very much like put on the headphones and sit in your room and like focus.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing them do it live was a real paradigm shift for me in terms of urgency. So I've seen a lot of bands perform live. The closest I've seen to performing live like this was a band called Explosions in the Sky.
You mentioned them earlier. Yeah.
They were a really great sort of post-rock band, a bit more on the melodic side, not as heavy, purely instrumental. I saw them perform at the Horseshoe Tavern, and it was like the loudest concert I've ever seen. It was very, very good. But they're kind of coming more from this emo side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the emo and the kind of the post-emo, sort of that early 2000s kind of.
Exactly.
I remember
ISIS doesn't have any of that.
Yeah, and I was surprised that I didn't find ISIS, because the other bands you mentioned, Dillinger and Explosions in the Sky, and there were bands that, like, in the early days of like Kazaa and LimeWire and shit, I would just find a band and go, that sounds like a cool band, and check it out. And I found a lot of those bands at that time.
Yeah.
Never found ISIS. And I'm curious, like, is there a reason for that? Like, they opened for Tool. Like, why have I never heard of this outside of you telling me?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I mean,
it could be my own fault.
Yeah,
like,
I think they really were darlings of the post-rock alt metal scene. They were widely respected by the intelligentsia of modern metal. 3 of the members of the band formed a side project with Chino from the Deftones after they broke up, and then Aaron Turner, the front man of the band, formed a new band called Sumac after they broke up. So that, they're around, but they just never really broke in that way. And I'm not sure why, because, like, as I said, listening to the music is an experience, but seeing them live, I don't quite know how to put this. Like, I've never seen a band perform with more urgency and conviction in my life. I've just never, like, I've watched really good bands. Like, I've seen bands like Tool perform many times, but like, when you watch a band like Tool, they're on stage in a stadium, and there's all kinds of lights and sounds and audio visual interactions, and the music is kind of amazing and mysterious. And so you're kind of, the Tool has always been a kind of band that hides behind their music. You don't really know who the individuals are. ISIS, when I watch them play, their music is similar. Like there's no ego in their music, but when you watch them perform it live, it is a collective effort. Like you can just see them trying in this really deep way. And it like the one guitar player whose name I forget right now, not the singer, the guy played his guitar so hard I thought he was going to break it in half. Like they were so enfolded into the activity of playing their music that it just is transformative. And I think it's just that seriousness that I resonate with. But I can imagine that would be alienating to some people because it's so much. Like you're like, holy fuck, this is wild. And not in a way where you're like, show me more. You're like, I'm overwhelmed. Right? Like this is rolling over me in a way that's actually challenging my senses and crushing me a bit. And like, I like that. And that's why the record's so brilliant, because it is called Panopticon, and it is quite explicitly a reflection on the philosophies of Jeremy Bentham.
I was going to say that's Bentham, right? Yeah.
Right. And when you drop into the record, the first song, So Did We, it's just like, it just comes and you're just in it. Like, you're just like, oh, I am surrounded by
the
music.
Beginning and the end of this record shocked the shit out of me, because I turned it on and there was no preamble, there was no build up, and
no foreplay.
To be fair, foreplay is what I would come to expect from this band, because all the other tracks on this record build. They build slowly, and they build over, like you said, 7 to 10 minutes. The first one, like it felt like Hans Zimmer slapping me in the face with his dick. You know what I mean? Like it was just that wall of sound out of the blue. And then the album ends just as abruptly. I was coming back. Like I said, I walked in a rainstorm today and listened to this record, which was possibly the best way to listen to this record, if I'm honest. I walked for an hour and a bit, and I was just coming back into my house as Grinning Faces was ending.
Grinning Mouths.
Or sorry, Grinning Mouths. Forgive me. I was literally coming into my door in the last 5-6 seconds. I'm like, and it was kind of like, you ever watched a movie where you're like, how are they going to, like, we got like 10 minutes left in this movie. How are they going to wrap this up? And the fact was they didn't. Right. They were just like, and done. End of record. And I was like there was part of me that almost felt some level of well, I won't make the sexual illusion, but you know what I'm talking. It felt like Blue Balls. It did. It felt
interesting.
Like, it felt like, oh shit, that's it.
I don't have that feeling. I think they bracketed the record with 2 songs that are a bit more like in your face, as a way of kind of like grabbing your attention and then pushing you out.
I was
the songs
surprised.
In between them are much more like drawn out, and like they start slow and they build,
and they're organic.
These songs kind of come in dick swinging, as it were.
They do.
And I think that was on purpose. One, to like say, this is what you signed up for, and the second is like, okay, and we're done now. Because the end of the last song is quite powerful. Like the keyboards and the guitar shrieking and just the heaviness of it. Like you're just like, and then when those last 4 notes just like down, 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 down,
done.
Like
done.
I'm like, thank God it's done.
I'll be honest with you.
I'm relieved it's over, right? Like that was an hour of just like oppressive, weighty music. And I want it, but I also want it just for that long and no more. You know, like that's, it's over when it's over, and it's good that it's over.
If there was any place for, you remember when Offspring released the record Smash, and they had those weird voiceovers like at the beginning and the end, and it's like, well, hope you enjoyed our time together here today. Seems harder and harder to just sit back and enjoy the fire. And I was like, that would have fit in this record.
Absolutely.
There. Hope you've enjoyed our time together today. And we're done. Because it really was just like, well, and that's it. And that was all they had to say. Really a very interesting choice, and a very interesting choice. It calls to mind Quentin Tarantino talked about putting Missalou, Dick Dale and the Deltones, in Pulp Fiction. And what he said about it was, it throws down a gauntlet where we're just saying we're big. Because that's a bow, 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 bow. Like that's a huge moment. And this record called that to mind for me, where it was like they are throwing down a gauntlet and they're going for the next 45 minutes, you are going to sit the fuck down, to your point, and listen and shut up and pay attention, because what we're going to do is going to be, like you said, not super sophisticated, but it is a journey, and it is a journey that you need to pay attention to in order to get the most out of it. With that said, I think that it's fair to say that you think that this is an objectively good record, but I would also like to know, and you've sort of touched on this a little bit personally, why this matters to you, whether it matters to you as a drummer or as a man, a person, a human being. What is it about this that speaks to you? And more to the point, why is this the record that you brought when I asked you bring your favorite record? Because you have a lot of records.
Yeah.
This is the one you brought, and I want to know, I would love to know
question.
Why.
Yeah, so I do think it's an objectively good record, but I do think it's an uneven record.
Yes.
I think that the fifth song, Syndic Calls, and the instrumental song, Altered Course, that these songs are a bit self-indulgent. So I don't think it's a perfect 10. I would probably include this record in my top 10 favorite records, but it would be low on the ranking in that list. So I do think it's an objectively good record, but it's an uneven record. And I think that's true of a lot of their albums. For me, this band, they have certain songs that are just utterly transcendent. And so this record has on it my favorite song ever. And that's why I chose it, because and not because of any, technical prowess or anything. It's just, it is a, so this is my favorite song on this record is the third track, and it's called In Fiction. And it's probably my favorite song of all time. And I can unpack that for you in quite a bit of detail if you'd like. But
yes,
the album itself, I think, just again, the album itself, their style, what they achieved on this record, and to a certain extent on the albums that came after this. The follow-up to this album, In the Absence of Truth, has a couple of songs on it that are just mind-bendingly good. What this band achieved in their writing dynamics was something I've always wanted to achieve in my own songwriting, which was the marriage of what I would call Mogwai or Godspeed style progression, where it's like, okay, we're going to spend 5 minutes in a 9-minute song building a crescendo, and it'll be worth it. I love that kind of songwriting. I love the just like boom, that, and then making you earn it. They married that particular writing style with heavy metal, right? And like, that's what I want. I want the heaviness of metal, the distortion, the melodic guitars that are like crushing, but I want a long ass build up to it. And that the patience that requires then creates emotional needs in the listener that are then delivered on when the crescendo capsizes in a climax. This album has songs in it, in particular the third song, that do that to such a pitch, like to such a level of intensity that for me to listen to it, it's actually like shakes me to my core. Like I feel like my body vibrating with it, and my emotions are just at the crest of it in a way that even now, we're 18 years or so after this album was released, I still listen to this song like on a weekly basis when I go for my walks, and every time I listen to it, I have a profoundly contemplative experience. And that's what I respect about these guys. They are relentlessly contemplative and urgent and serious in their approach. And I think that's alienating to some people, because at the end of the day, a lot of people go to music to make them feel good and to just sort of enjoy in a certain way. Passively. This music isn't always enjoyable. It's uncomfortable in some ways. And I find that to be productive to digest. And this particular, the third song, In Fiction, the last song, Grinning Mouths, and to a lesser extent, the opening song, So Did We, represent a form of musical achievement that I haven't seen echoed in a lot of other places. And so this is the only place I really get what I want. So
would you want to meet the people that made this?
Yeah, of course. Just to say thank you. They were quite self-aware of their philosophical influences. Like, these guys have read Bentham and Foucault. They are pretty, curmudgeonly but serious and sophisticated, and that's my frequency. So I would love to sit down with these guys and just talk about their music and to express my gratitude, because for me, as I said, this record and this band in particular, very much a transition band for me, very much a band that taught me about certain moments or kinds of writing that resonate on an emotional level that can be quite literally transformative, and to rely on that kind of music in my personal life to find strength and inspiration to deal with frankly, a quite complicated and often challenging life. So the music is profoundly existential for me, and I rely on it to feel supported and to feel strong and to feel patient when I need to, when I'm dealing with things.
Are there moments specifically that you turn to this record?
Yeah, I mean, the third track in particular is, like I said, it's literally my favorite piece of music. So I listen to it a lot, and the kinds of moments that I use it for are moments where I'm feeling frustrated,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm looking for, and I'm trying to steel myself with a bit of resolution to have a forward-facing, hopeful gaze in the face of challenges. And so I listen to it because, this song coaches patience. Like, they don't even like shift the dynamic of the opening riff for 3 minutes. Like, they just make you sit for 3 minutes and just listen to them kind of like quietly jam on a groove. And it's 9 minutes. It's 9 minutes of pure glory, really. And so when I listen to this song, it's a song that tells me, be patient, and the payoff will come if you continue to have discipline and virtue and to do your best and to keep working on yourself. That the things you're looking for, the things that are challenging you, the things you're looking for will come, the things that are challenging you will be resolved, and you will become a better version of yourself. The narrative of the song, the lyrics are a bit more about the surveillance state, but the last line of the song says, "Yet under this mortal sun we cannot hide ourselves." And it's a very poignant piece of reflection, because it's invoking this idea that, like, the origin of all of our life is itself mortal, and we can't hide from that. We can't hide ourselves, and we have to face that in the light of day. And if you do that with a certain level of grit, and you do that with a certain level of poise, which the music represents, I think, in its articulation, in its dynamics, in its patience, then you stand to benefit, you stand to learn, you stand to grow. And I feel like the song has this organic kind of forward-facing momentum in it. And then when it really capsizes at the end, it's, for my money, pound for pound, one of the most profound and glorious moments of music I've ever heard. And every time I listen to it, it shakes me to my core, and I just feel amazing. I'm just like, it's so great. Like, I look like a maniac when I'm walking out of my neighborhoods. I'm just air guitaring and just rocking out like unapologetically. And it's
interesting. You air guitar and not air drum.
I do air guitar. I do both. I kind of a polysemous air instrumentalist.
I love it. I have to ask, in the face of what you just said, and in the face of the influence that this record has had on you, do you engage with this the same way today that you did when you heard it in 2004?
I engage with it more now.
How?
Well, when it came out, I was still in a certain phase of life, in a certain way of understanding music, and their approach kind of showed me that there was a different way of making music, of performing music. And I resonated with their urgency and their seriousness and their sincerity. Now, 18 years later, I'm looking down the barrel of 40 years old. My kid's about to become a teenager. I haven't really played in any bands in a long time. I still play my drums, but I've grown up quite a bit. And the emotions that this music brought up for me when it came out are more real now in me. Like they're the themes that they're exploring, the weight that they are carrying and contemplating feels more real to me in my life now, because I have much more responsibilities and challenges in my life. And so the weight of this record resonates more with 38-year-old Sean than it did with 20-year-old Sean. Because when I was 20 years old, I thought I knew everything, and I was, I was playing a lot more, and I had my own ideas. And now I'm a lot less certain, and I'm a lot more grounded. And the patience of what they're doing, the slowness of what they're doing, the dynamics, the build, that part of it is much more transparent and reflective of the kind of life that I'm living now. And so the album functions more as a soundtrack to my life than it ever did, because the weight and patience of it is much more immediately isomorphic with the weight and patience that I deal with in my career, in my family life, in my personal life. And so it resonates even stronger now than it did then, I think.
If you were to be asked to describe this record in a single word, what would the word be that you would choose?
One word: patience.
You've come back and back to that. I'm curious about that statement, because you've mentioned that the music is patient and that it builds in its own time and so on. Do you think that a listener needs to be as patient, or do you think that this is something that needs to be waited for like a young hothead who's listening to the Ramones or the Rollins Band or Black Flag, or, and they're there, stiff dick, stiff middle finger, ready to fuck off the world? Like, do you think this is something that they come to later, or do you think this is something that they could embrace more, at an earlier time in their lives?
I think that's subject relative. Like for me, it landed pretty hard, and it did, and it actually, I got away from a lot of that music that I was listening to at the time. A lot of that hardcore. The only kind of post-hardcore band that I still listen to is Misery Signals, but I listen to a lot more post-rock. And post metal. Like that's something that became the mainstay of my listening since then. So I think that this is a band that can be appreciated by a young punk rock hothead if they're open, if they're interested in serious music. But it is not for the faint of heart. It really it is. It's almost too serious in a way. And that's what I like about it, because I'm too serious. And so I'm like, oh, someone sees me. Some stranger with some guitars that I've never met understands. And they've managed to create a sound wall with that feeling that I can resonate with. Thank you. But for the young hothead, I think it really depends. Some people are sort of stuck in their frequency. And if they are, this would not communicate, I don't think. But for me, I will flatter myself as a younger man enough to say that I was pretty open to a lot of different things. And this really filled a gap that I didn't know was there. Because I was like, because I was, at that time, I was obsessed with post-rock bands like Mogwai and Sigur Rós and Explosions in the Sky and Godspeed You Black Emperor. I loved that music. And I loved the alternative metal, of which I saw Tool as being like the gods. They're my favorite band of all time by far. And ISIS was a band that like stuck right in the middle of that. And I'm like, yeah, I want that. I want someone who understands what makes post-rock good and has the patience to just like jam on a riff for 9 minutes like Mogwai does, but also has like distortion pedals and like hair on their balls. And like, that's what ISIS was for me. And so it was a big missing piece in my aesthetic sensibilities that I was just very grateful to receive when I understood it and I was able to hear it, So yeah, I think that this is a band that any serious music listener could understand and respect. Whether or not it will resonate with you on an emotional level is just, I think, a subject relative question that every individual will have to address for themselves. I know I was a grindcore, hothead tech drummer, and I listened to this and went, "Holy shit, this is good." Someone else might hear it and be like, "This is slow and boring," and that would be fair, I think, because I don't think this is a perfect record. I think this is an uneven record, but it has the greatest song of all time on it, so it gets a pass.
Okay, so maybe that is the answer to the question that I was about to ask, because when I do Kruegerecords, I ask people to bring the record that is like the perfect record for them, and I guess I shouldn't be terribly surprised that you would go, "This is the perfect record," but also I have notes, because right. that is you to a T. And it's part of the reason that I wanted you to come on the show, because you bring stuff that is like, this is flawed, but that's okay. And with that in mind, how has this album influenced you, whether it's as a drummer or just as a human?
Yeah.
How have you walked away from this, and how have you internalized this record?
So one thing I will say is, like, I do think there are perfect records. This isn't one of them, but I think the reason we ended up talking about this record is because when we were sort of having our preliminary chats about it, I mentioned that this album had what I thought was the best piece of music I've ever heard, and you're like, "Okay, let's talk about that."
Yeah.
But if I can think of all kinds of records that, for my money, are perfect. So like Tool's Lateralis is a perfect album. Radiohead's OK Computer is a perfect album. Death Cab for a Cutie's Plans is a perfect album. I could go on and on and on. Like Peter Gabriel's Up is a perfect record, in my opinion, right? There are many perfect records, and I'd be happy to talk about them. But this record just happens to have what for me is the most profound piece of music I've ever heard in my life on it. And I think that was why you were like, "Okay, we're going to do that one." I was like, "Great, let's do it." So listening to this record, what I took away from it, it affected me on a lot of levels, actually. So one level that it really affected me on was as a player. I started thinking more about my form.
Mm-hmm.
So as a drummer, before I started listening to ISIS, I was really obsessed with like great drumming, right? So my favorite drummers, the drummers who I modeled my style, like I consciously was like, these are the people that I want to sound like, was Danny Carey of Tool, Neil Peart of Rush, and Jimmy Chamberlin of the Smashing Pumpkins. Those were the guys that I wanted to sound like, because they had the chops and the flow. And they're all very busy drummers in a way.
Yes, actually, I, not being a percussionist, I can see the through line between those three performers in a very real way.
Jimmy Chamberlin had a rock sensibility and an ability to be busy without sounding silly.
He is my second favorite 90s drummer of all time.
So great. Danny Carey is a living god. As far as I'm concerned, like, he's just like, he is on another level. He is his own person. He's his own musician. He's a very special musical being. And then Neil Peart is just pound for pound, in my mind, the greatest rock drummer of all time.
Neil Peart is Neil Peart.
Period. And so these were the guys that I was trying to sound like. And I I would say at my peak in my early mid 20s, I was getting, close enough. I was pretty damn good at the time. And listening to these guys play was informative. It was just like, oh, can you slow the fuck down? Can you play a beat? Can you get really serious about like stroke pattern, about like flow, and weight, not just technical prowess and speed and flair and precision, but feel it in your whole body when you're playing. And even when you're playing something very simple or relatively simple, can you communicate urgency through that playing? I learned, though, I started to ask myself those questions from listening to this band. So it really affected me as a player in those ways. as a listener, even more profound. It made me start listening to slower music, right? It really transitioned me out of a lot of post-hardcore, a lot of fast, frenetic, post-adolescent angst into a more adult aesthetic. And I started to slow down. I started to resonate in my listening and in my thinking and in my intellectual and spiritual development on a lower frequency. And to recognize that a steady, weighty pulse can still embrace all and understand reality in the way that like a very frenetic, fast moving pulse can touch a bunch of parts of reality. But if you do it in the slow, steady way, you'll actually retain more. You won't piss as many people off, and you'll cover just as much ground. And so the music kind of represented for me a sonic manifestation of a psychological transition in my intellectual and spiritual development that I still return to. Like I still listen to this music all the time. Because it resonates on a frequency that kind of goes right into the center of my body, and it is the soundtrack to becoming a more mature human being for me, and that's why it's such an important band in my life.
That is one of the more profound things that has been said on this show. ISIS Panopticon, guys, check it the fuck out. I want to know if there is ancillary music, other music that is related to this that you would recommend. If people that listen to this show go out and listen to Panopticon and fucking love it and go, this is my shit from now on, what do they listen to from here? Caspian
is, in my mind, the greatest post-rock band of all time. Really? So they're very much in a tradition of Mogwai and Explosions in the Sky and Godspeed You Black Emperor, but they love their Tool. So they're like ISIS, except they're more instrumental, less distorted, and a bit more resolved. So you get a lot more, like the payoffs that you get in songs like So Did We, In Fiction, Grinning Mouths, and other albums of ISIS. So, you know, the other two records of these guys that people should listen to if they really, you know, all their albums are good, but the album before this, Oceanic, was where they really sort of transitioned out of being a sludge metal, doom metal band into this more progressive, curious, progressive band. And then the album after this, In the Absence of Truth, has the final track on that album, Garden of Light, is one of the most remarkable, beautiful, uplifting songs I've ever heard. But yeah, Caspian is a really good band that I would recommend for people who like this kind of stuff. Later music by a band called The Ocean, everything from anthropocentric and heliocentric onwards, I think would be something people would really enjoy if they like this kind of music. The Ocean is one of the most sophisticated, philosophically reflective musical acts going today. Their most recent double album, Phanerozoic 1 and 2, is some of the most sophisticated progressive metal and philosophically rich reflections on the nature of memory and identity constitution and life that I've ever heard. So the two bands that I would recommend the most, you know, that sort of I got deeply into out of this are The Ocean and Caspian. And actually one other band that I will plug, because I do think they're probably the best metal band in the world, Intronaut. Intronaut is an incredible band. They're more on the metal side, more technical, more busy, but very much in this wheelhouse, and remarkable band. So Caspian, The Ocean, and Intronaut, those would be the ones that I would recommend.
And in the interim, there are places that our listeners can find you and your music, because as I've mentioned more than once on this episode, you are a tremendous drummer in your own right, and you have done really terrific music with a bunch of different bands. And you also, in case we have forgotten, are a professor of philosophy. and you have stuff to talk about that too. So please tell my people where they can find your people.
Right. Well, so this is, you're asking me to just plug myself now.
Yes, I am.
So I believe that the links to my various websites can be found below where you clicked to listen to this. But yeah, I have my first band that I was in my late teens and early 20s was called Epsilon, and we released a full-length record called Spending an Evening with Inevitability, which was 60 minutes of basically us trying to take post-hardcore bands like Grade and the Dillinger Escape Plan and Poison the Well and marry it to progressive metal acts like Tool and ISIS and Mogwai. And I think that was a relatively successful effort. We didn't achieve any commercial success with that record, but I think we achieved some musical success with it. So there's a Bandcamp page to that record linked below. There's also a Bandcamp page that I've put together of a bunch of songs that I was part of from a few different projects. And it's, I believe the URL is seanthedrummer.bandcamp.com, which is also linked below. A band that I was in before I left Toronto to come to Hawaii to take up my professorship is called Omnivert, and they just released a 3-song EP actually. And I was very close with those guys, and I think they made some really great music, and I think we made some great music together. And I've since been replaced, and they've really moved on in a way that I'm happy for. I'm proud of them for that. And there's some of the songs that I recorded with them are on that Bandcamp page of mine. I think there's one other band called Surmiser that I was in that recorded a record that I've linked below as well. So that's sort of like all the music that I have available. Academically speaking, there are 2 web pages that you might check out if you want to hear what I think about like ideas. One is a sort of public facing YouTube essays page, which is linked below. And this is me just trying to talk about different things. There are academic lectures. There are dialogues with psychologists and philosophers that I'm colleagues and friends with. There are commentaries on music and media. And then there are sort of like existential essays about things ranging from cancel culture to dating dynamics to the nature of love. So it's really kind of just a public facing general audience philosophical video essay page. And then the other webpage that's linked below is my personal academic webpage, where you'll find like my technical research and my published works, which are focused mostly between early Indian Buddhist philosophy and contemporary cognitive science, in particular questions about the nature of emotion and perception and how feelings structure our experience and our judgments. And that's sort of, if you want to read things that I've written in technical philosophy journals about the nature of consciousness, that's where you would go. So that's sort of all my stuff.
I, on a personal note, would highly recommend our listeners checking out, at the very least, Sean's YouTube page, because this man is one of the more human people I have ever met in my life. And it's been an absolute delight to talk to you in a professional capacity about music for the first time in
about time, I say.
Better part of 20 years. You and I have known each other, and I've always wanted to talk music with you, and I've always wanted to talk about all of these things. And I'm very delighted that you were able to make the time. So thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, and thank you.
And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on our musical journey and for being a patron, because you're paying for this shit. And I don't know why, but I appreciate it very much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this week's episode. So feel free to get at me at Composers Pod or Alex James Tunes on Twitter. Like the man says, music is the glue of the world. It holds it all together. Without it, life would be meaningless. That's all for this week, friends. I have been Krueger, and this has been Kruegerecords.